For her invitation to speak here, and Carmen and Pablo for organising us and the Colloquium, and Lucretia as well for all of her help with getting us here and making us so comfortable. So I'm going to briefly say the things I'm going to go through in the presentation. So I'm going to start by thinking about contradiction in the narrative form, and I'm going to think about the way that narrative works in education and educational research, questions of social justice for narrative and educational research. I'm going to talk a bit about a concept called the possible selves concept, which is something that I've used in some narrative research that I've done, and how I sort of bring this into dialogue with the idea of narrative, and particularly the idea of impossibility. I'm going to talk about researching impossibility, and then a lot of the focus of the presentation is on the idea that the conclusion is part of the form of narrative. It's something that the narrative kind of works towards, and I'm going to be thinking about that and ending with some ideas about that. So I want to start by saying that it's really welcome to be speaking about narrative theory and narrative methodology. It's something that informs my research as well as my teaching practice. It's always underpinned by narrative as a form. I find it difficult to think outside of narrative or to see anything really in terms other than narrative, and it's hard to disagree with these ideas about narrative here. Melanie mentioned this one already, that storytelling is an essential human activity. It's what humans do. It's an act by which we assert our humanity, and it's through narrative that people create themselves. These suggest that narrative is fundamental to the ways in which the self understands itself, and also to the ways in which others recognize and understand one another. And I think the reason we're here is that this idea that narrative enables recognition then prompts us to ask questions about whose narratives are heard and recognized, and further questions then about whether everyone in fact has access to the use of the narrative form in the first place. And the other connected reason that we're here is that we're thinking about or conducting educational research that seeks to explore narratives, and I think probably all of us, particularly looking at people and in places that are not always recognized or heard, and to add these to existing narratives about educational experience, perhaps even to enable those we're working with to participate in, contribute to, and disrupt existing narratives. So then what I want to think about in this presentation is the form of narrative, including some of its complexities and limitations, and then to think about what those complexities and limitations mean in methodological terms for research that has these important aims that we all share. So I want to draw on some of the ways that I've used narrative in both theory and also in methodology of a couple of projects that I've been involved in. So I want to start by thinking about how contradictory the narrative form is. And on one hand, it's so fundamental that it feels natural. It makes sense. It's as if it echoes or reflects the patterns by which we live. On the other hand, it's actually quite complex. And to give a narrative account of ourselves or our lives or our educational experiences, in fact, takes a great deal of work. Because it's so natural or naturalized, we're often not aware of the work we're doing when we create narratives, but the work is there. Looking more closely at the work of narrative, I've used the literary theory of Recur and the philosophical theory of Judith Butler. And both of these theorists highlight aspects of the process and production of a narrative that are far more complex and contradictory than they seem. So Butler takes a psychoanalytic perspective and argues that telling a coherent story of ourselves in fact requires a splitting of the self. So Butler argues that there is one part of the self that gives the narrative and another part of the self that features in the narrative, and both parts call themselves I. So you have this one person who's giving a narrative, and the narrative is about the person in the narrative. Both parts call themselves I, but one exists in the present, an I who is telling the story. The other exists in the past and is the I that the story is about. They coexist but do not meet in the narrative. There's always an I who is removed from the narrative because they're in the process of telling it, of looking at the story of themselves and deciding how to represent it. I should say Butler's argument is far more complex than my representation of it. But what I take from this aspect of her theorization is that the most coherent narrative, the most plausible story of a self or a life or an experience is also always split. The narrative form is contradictory at its core and never more so than when it seems coherent or complete. So Ricoeur's theorization of the narrative form also emphasizes contradiction. So Ricoeur looks at the process of listening to a story rather than telling it. And he argues that we listen to narratives using two different time frames. So here you've got the kind of basic structure of a narrative where you have an introduction, you have events, and you have a conclusion. And in the first time frame, we follow, according to this arrow, the events as they're presented to us in a progressive sequence that ends with a conclusion. In the second, we work backwards from each event in the narrative to check that the events link together in the way that we might expect. As we reach the conclusion, we're looking forward expectantly, but we are also looking backwards to judge whether the conclusion meets what Ricoeur calls the condition of contingency. That is, whether the causal connections between each event are legible and reasonable, and whether the story can then be judged to be acceptable after all, which is what Ricoeur calls it. Seen in this way, narratives must meet two simultaneous time frames and be legible in both directions. We should be able to say both that a story has reached its conclusion and that the conclusion was caused or justified by the events that preceded it. So I'm aware that Ricoeur's ideas, using Ricoeur's ideas to look at the complication of narrative could be seen to contradict his arguments about narrative capability, the idea that the very first and most fundamental capability is to be able to speak in narrative form. I don't think that there is a contradiction there. I think it's important to think about how complicated the narrative form is, the conformity it requires, precisely because the form is so fundamental to capability. What these theorizations have in common is a sense of the fragility of narrative and our relationship to it, and that this fragility is a consequence of the form of narrative itself. Because the form requires temporal organization, sequencing, causality, and conclusion, because it requires both a narrator and a character, the form requires the management of these narrative features. And if it is, as I said when I started speaking, the primary way of recognizing oneself and being recognized by others, then there are high stakes for the maintenance of the narrative form. To see narrative capability as essential to social and epistemic justice is therefore to see both that it enables the expression and the recognition of the person as a subject, and that it requires the subject to conform to a particular kind of self-expression, one that is very naturalized, but that nevertheless imposes some conditions. I particularly began to think about these conditions when I started working in education. And I think education has, in many different places, in many different ways, exaggerated versions of the narrative form. And they're everywhere in an educational environment. So, for anyone who has filled in a plan for a teaching session or module, written or conformed to a meeting agenda, proposed or carried out a research project, most of the actions we carry out in educational context would meet the criteria of the narrative form. They're composed of events carried out sequentially with connections between them. They're carefully ordered with introductions, conclusions, and causal links. While this is true for those working in education or educational research, it's also true for anyone participating in education. Narrative structures the experience of education, partly because education is part of daily life, and daily life is structured in narrative form, but also partly because education exaggerates aspects of the narrative form. So the linear, progressive format in which education happens, from the micro-processes of lessons and learning to the larger processes through which individuals move forward in age, level, and qualification, all rely upon the kind of temporal sequencing that's consistent with the narrative form. And in addition to that, from early participation in education systems, the frequency of questions of what a student might be, what they might study or are already studying in order to become, create the requirement of a future-oriented narrative as explanation of the present. So the student talks about their present experience, often in the context of its conclusion, what it will become, what they will become, and what the experience is for in those terms. So I am learning this now, for example, in order that in the future I will have achieved this, or have qualified to do that. Narrative is therefore an organizing feature in education systems. The format of learning and the administration of learning environments is narrative, and the expressions of what has been learned and what the learning is for on the parts of students is similarly in narrative form. So there are two questions that I think are particularly important in social justice terms, given the heightened importance of narrative to education. And with each question, there are some associated challenges and questions for research and researchers. So the first is a question of who. And there are several questions about who. So who is included and excluded by the narrative form of education? For example, as I will go on to suggest, when educational contexts and systems require a clear vision of the future from students, there are social and structural factors that make this kind of vision more or less easy to imagine and articulate, or that delineate particular kinds of futures as more or less acceptable and recognizable in narrative terms than others. On one hand, given that educational research generates its own narratives of what education is, there is the opportunity to add previously excluded experiences to this narrative, even to change who and what is recognizable. And it's important to do exactly that. On the other hand, sometimes what we're adding to the narrative is a story of absence or lack or limitation, which is one of the ways of arguing that there should be different narratives available, but which I think is harder to produce collaboratively with participants, and I think that's one of the things that we're talking about over these 2 days. I'll say more about this later in relation to my own research, but to add an anecdotal experience here, I once attended a seminar in the UK which was looking at multiple issues affecting access to higher education for working class students there, and which largely used Bourdieu as a theoretical tool to highlight the kinds of social and cultural capital still required to negotiate the elite institutions in the UK. Every researcher there was passionate about the injustices of a system that's built on exclusion through these social and cultural knowledges, and there was a great deal of discussion about the students who didn't have access to the resources they needed. Hardly any of those attending the seminar realized that the final presentation was being made by several students who participated in a study looking at the experiences of working class students, and that these students had been present throughout the day and had heard all of the discussions. As they made their way to the front of the room to give their seminar, one of them remarked sarcastically that he might find it difficult to make it all the way from the back to the front of the room, given all of the capital he was lacking. It was an uncomfortable moment, and one that stays with me when I think about how to articulate inequality on behalf of, but without disempowering those experiencing the most injustice. The second question that I think is important in education is that of what, as well as who. So what is left out when narrative coherence is required? Given that the narrative form requires a complex negotiation that covers up incoherence, and that we are aware, however unconsciously, that narrative must meet the requirements of contingency, in which events are connected causally and plausibly, are there parts of experience that are always excluded or on the periphery of any narrative? This question has a further complication for educational researchers. When we set out to redress social and epistemic injustice by ensuring that participants' narratives are heard and that they're able to make a narrative contribution, are we also reproducing the requirement that they conform to the terms that education already demands of them? Is there a way that educational research narratives produced with participants can move outside of the narrative structures that govern education more broadly? I've thought about this question particularly through using a concept called possible selves. This was first introduced in the US by social psychologists Marcus and Neurius in 1986. And they describe it here, that this type of self-knowledge pertains to how individuals think about their potential and about their future. Possible selves are the ideal selves that we would very much like to become. They're also the selves that we could become and the selves that we are afraid of becoming. And this is something I can talk more about if you have questions about how this interacts perhaps with other theories that you are using. The concept essentially describes how the ways we experience the present are influenced by imagined versions of the self in the future. The concept suggests that these versions of ourselves are personalized and embodied so that we feel as well as thinking them. They can be multiple and contradictory. They can be versions of ourselves that we're afraid of becoming, as this quotation suggests, as well as working towards becoming in a more positive way. Like others using this concept, I've suggested that possible selves is inherently a narrative concept because it shows how the stories we have of ourselves are temporally complex, and they rely upon sequential and causal connections between different time frames. In particular, I see the concept as showing how we narrate ourselves and our experiences according to the narrative temporality described by Ricoeur. So, seen in this way, we make sense of our present experiences by connecting them causally to the future or the futures that we imagine, perhaps the conclusion of the narrative. I'm doing this now, for example, because it will enable me to become this in the future, or I'm doing this now because it will stop me becoming this in the future. In terms of the questions I raised earlier regarding who and what is excluded from educational narratives and educational research, the possible selves concept can be useful in several ways. At its simplest and most powerful, the concept has similarities to the idea of narrative capability. Through using it and discussing it in educational research, there's the potential to highlight who's able to imagine a future at all, to tell the story of that future, and to have that future heard and recognized. So what kind of structures make futures more or less imaginable for some people, and what kinds of future? So similarly, the kinds of futures that can be imagined and realistically worked towards, and this is something that in literature about possible selves, there's a lot of discussion of. One of the essential ideas of the possible selves concept is that the more detailed, the more detail you have in the way you've imagined something makes it more likely that you will be able to achieve it. So if you imagine something in quite a distant or abstract way, you're less likely to achieve it than if you have imagined it very closely and thought very carefully about it. And I have my own views on that use of the possible selves concept, which I can discuss later as well. But the kind of futures that can be imagined can be seen in terms of epistemic and social justice and injustice. This can be at the level of the further study and career goals that students are working towards, can lead to questions of which options seem more or less possible to particular groups of students, and what social and systemic barriers still exist around elite academic and career pathways. In terms of epistemic justice, there are also questions such as, have students had the kinds of access to education that allow them to imagine contributing to knowledge? What kinds of knowledge do they see themselves being able to participate in making? There are further avenues of inquiry within these questions regarding types of curriculum, the knowledges that are valued there, which pertain both to the movements to decolonize university curricula and also to the much debated places of theoretical knowledge in vocational and technical learning. I've also thought about the possible selves concept to think about the role of place in influencing what is possible for students to imagine for their future. In this, I was particularly influenced by a US researcher, Prince, who looked at the ways possible selves have been used in studies of young people in juvenile detention centers in the US, who had been found to lack the kind of detailed, positive imagined futures that researchers felt would enable them to move forward into those futures. And Prince argued that none of the studies had considered that the young people were being asked to imagine a future while being surrounded by the walls of a prison cell. The walls, she argued, were almost literal barriers to the ways that the future could be imagined, and yet none of the researchers had considered the physicality of place in the young people's thinking. As I'll go on to explain, I've tried to find ways of exploring place and its role in narratives of the future, though not always in ways that appear successful, depending on the terms by which we judge success in research. This avenue of inquiry is another way of looking at who's included in educational narratives, in that it asks whether some people have a place from which imagining a future and making those coherent links to the present is an easy task. And if so, if some people do have that access, then there must be places which put up more barriers between the present and the future. In relation to the second question I raised earlier, which was about what is included and excluded from educational narratives, I think the challenge is greater for researchers. I've been very aware when asking students participating in my research how they imagine their future, that I'm repeating a question that they have answered in various ways to various people repeatedly and have done so throughout their educational journey. Somewhat paradoxically, this repetition is in fact one of the reasons I was drawn to using the possible selves concept in the first place. I felt that the concept described something that was already there, permeating the way education was understood, and that therefore it offered a way of seeing some of the inequalities in the system. If the future is such a fundamental way of moving through education, then looking at how the future is experienced and even accessed differently for some than for others seemed an important thing to ask. Despite this reasoning, the sense of reproducing a familiar question remains. In some ways, the context of a research project offers a different space, a different kind of recognition, and perhaps these differences, when students are participating in educational research, offer the possibility that another narrative could be given, that might be given in a different classroom context, for example, and another kind of recognition can take place. But I have also often returned to a question I was asked when I first presented my work using possible selves. I was asked whether, given the focus on possibility in the naming of the concept also has room for looking at impossibility. On the face of it, I was able to respond that yes, because my focus was inequality. I was essentially looking at the ways that some futures seem less possible than others. But I've been troubled ever since by how methodologically and conceptually difficult it is to carry out research into impossibility. In carrying out educational research, there are immediate practical barriers to researching with people who've been excluded from education altogether. They are not there. Inevitably, the research is done with those who found it possible, however difficult it might have been, to be present. In my doctoral research, the higher education students I was working with had experienced multiple barriers to studying for a degree. The people I was not able to speak to were the people who had to rush away to their jobs or their childcare. There were others who stopped attending between the first time I met them and the second time. I could offer conjecture about what was impossible for them, so impossible that they gave up their degree, but their narratives remain largely untold. Absence is not the only way, however, in which a narrative does not capture impossibility. As I said earlier, and as the narrative theory suggests, a narrative already obeys the rules which make it recognizable at the cost of smoothing over the incoherence at its core. If I think about the possible selves concept and the question I was asked about it, I always come up against the same truth. Impossibility can be narrated. A person can give an account of something they found too difficult to continue doing or being. So I felt that with asking people about what they imagined, I could ask them and gain narratives of what they imagined was possible. I could also, and I'm going to talk about this in a second, speak to them about what perhaps they'd once imagined was possible but had turned out to be impossible. But if something is impossible to imagine, if a person is precluded from ever having entertained it as an idea, if it is in fact unimaginable, how can it be narrated then? And a nagging feeling suggests to me that this, the impossible to imagine, this is what would tell us the most about inequality. If this is the case, then our capacity to answer the who question of who is included in and excluded from educational narratives is hampered a little by the what question of what is always excluded from the narrative. In being shaped towards its conclusion, towards the question of whether it is recognizable and acceptable after all, in Ricoeur's terms, the narrative form excludes the impossible. A key question for me then, and one on which I'll focus for the remainder of this presentation, is whether there are ways of capturing the impossibilities and incoherences that surround educational narratives, and what our role as researchers is in finding and interpreting these. So there are examples in methodological literature, particularly around narrative research, of ways in which coherence of participant narratives might be interrupted and then interpreted. So some examples of these, Watson, for example, looks for inconsistency in pronoun use across narratives. So she suggests that if someone narrates themselves inconsistently as part of a group and then as excluded from a group, we might look at whether that narrative is coherent and what perhaps is being left out. There's some evidence of uncertainty, she argues, in that. Holloway and Jefferson look at contrasting or contradictory moments in interviews, particularly focusing on accounts of opposing emotions that do not appear to make sense when you look at the narrative as a whole. Kawabata and Gastaldo looked at silence in qualitative research data, which I think is really interesting, and I think Matsai and Jackson also looked at this. They considered the ways in which responses to silence are shaped by social and cultural paradigms of individuality and collectivity. And perhaps for me, the example that demonstrates the power of narrative and the narrative form the most is a paper by Riak, Rumans and Tyler, where they actually explicitly set up their data collection method of anti-narrative as a response to Butler's work about the cost and the work involved in creating coherence. So they asked their participants to use mapping and drawing methods that were explicitly non-linear to represent themselves. So for example, they used a Venn diagram or a mind map. So they were working against this idea of creating a linear temporal coherence. In interviews, they then asked participants to focus on parts of their own stories that they saw, the participants saw, as incongruous or inconsistent. This last approach perhaps clarifies most powerfully how difficult the narrative form is to move away from. In order to work against narrative, the participants in the study produced alternative narratives, the narratives they might otherwise not have given. But they still did so, as far as I was concerned, they were doing so in a narrative form, because it's so difficult not to. You might focus your narrative on something other than you might have done, but it remains a narrative. How else could the story be recognized? I want to give one or two examples from my own research of where I feel I've been closest to locating impossibility, and then to consider what my role is in responding to it as a researcher. Jacqueline Stevenson has written in her work using possible selves with refugee and migrant women in the UK about the importance of the lost self. So where there has been loss or disruption, she argues, The possible selves articulated by participants might not be imagined futures, but lost pasts, or even the imagined future once imagined, whose possibility has been lost. I found this to be the case too in my research with students who are studying for degrees in non-traditional ways, studying in further education colleges, which are similar to vet colleges here in England. The institutions are less elite than universities in a variety of ways, including that they are mainly positioned in the vocational and training sector, though they do not only offer vocational and technical subjects. Many of the students I spoke to imagined themselves as having gone to a far more prestigious institution, had once imagined themselves as having gone to a more prestigious institution, and their imagined self at that institution lived alongside their current educational journey. It was used in their narratives as a causal connection between their past and their present. So because I was unable to go to university as I had planned, I did this instead. It made their present acceptable after all, in Ricoeur's terms. At the same time, this future that they described as impossible was often imagined in great detail, including the ways they might have behaved, the friends they might have made, the spaces they might have occupied. Impossibility can be articulated in this way, and a methodological approach that looks at narratives of the future can also capture past narratives of the future by thinking about what people once imagined, what they still imagine. This has similarities to Riac, Rumin's, and Tyler's approach in that the narrative form is still obeyed. Impossibility and some temporal incoherence is there in these accounts, and it tells us important things about how students view their education, what they and others value and what has been difficult for them. Perhaps the most important finding from this aspect of this research project was in response to those who assume that people who've not attended an elite institution have never imagined doing so, and are therefore unaffected by the stratification and the snobbery of such a system. It's been useful to be able to say this is not the case, that the power of an elite education is felt even and especially where it has been absent. There have been other moments in conducting narrative research in which impossibility has entered the process of the research itself. Participants have literally refused to acquiesce to the narrative terms I have set out. And I have 3 examples of this. The first 2 are from my doctoral research, and the last from a project I'm working on now. Because I was using the possible selves concept in my doctoral research, I asked student participants to tell me about the future they imagined, to bring with them to one of the interviews pictures that represented that future. Most of them did so, but one student simply said, "I don't think about the future, sorry." He repeated this several times throughout 2 interviews. And to clarify more about the context of this statement, I should say that this student attended a college with large banners outside proclaiming the college's high levels of post-study employment. To enter the building, in which he studied for 3 years, he passed 3 life-size cardboard figures of graduates with gowns and mortarboards. They were those ones that they had a space for your head, so you could put your head into it and imagine yourself as a graduate. In these circumstances, it was an act of resistance to refuse to give a narrative of the future. I should also add that this was not a student for whom the future could be casually approached. He didn't have parental income to fall back on, or a high-income job waiting for him, and he'd study a humanities subject for his degree, so he didn't have an immediate career pathway in front of him. When I last spoke to him, he was weeks away from graduating, so the future was making itself felt, but his refusal remained. So that's one example of where an expected narrative and a narrative method comes up against some kind of impossibility. I said earlier that I've tried to use methods which explore participants' relationships to place and to space, and to think how these might shape their educational experiences. I've done this in 2 ways. The first was to use mobile interviewing. in which I asked participants to walk with me around the college spaces and say how they used them. There's a lot to say about the methodological challenges involved in this approach. I don't know if anyone's used it, but actually some things I hadn't considered were things like how you might record and how you might hear what's on the recording whilst you're walking and perhaps past a lot of people. Another is that a lot of the literature on this approach is very much suggesting that what it does is hand some power to your research participants, that they then are guiding you around something rather than being sort of required to respond to your questions. And I would say there were one or two instances in which I felt that that happened. However, actually, the most common response when I explained what the mobile interview involved was that the students simply remained seated and said they didn't use the college spaces at all. One or two of them pointed to a room or space from which they were sitting, but still without moving. Again, this could be seen as a form of resistance to the demand for a particular kind of story, a refusal to provide the narrative account of the space that I was asking for. Finally, in the project I'm currently working on, I've used a form of participatory mapping. So I've asked students to mark on a map of the place in which they live, and as Pippa said, this is looking at islands. These are very small islands, so I would give them a map of the island. To mark on that map for me, places they often or never go to, places that mean something to them, places they like or don't like, places they might one day like to go. Again, this has had a range of responses, one of which is to make a single mark on the map to show the location of a participant's home and to say that they never go anywhere else. I should add that this was far from the only time that narratives of place have been challenging to create with research participants. As one student put it when I asked her how she felt about the town in which she'd lived for the whole of her life, "I've always lived here, I've never thought about what it's like." I've thought a great deal about the different ways to interpret and work with these points of what feels like impossibility or resistance in the research process. As I said in my explanation of them, one way of seeing them is as a kind of resistance or refusal, either in response to the specific process or the discourses evoked by them. A refusal to give the same repeated story about the future, for example, might be a resistance to the ways that education is structured around the future. At the same time, these could be moments in which a different, unexpected narrative is established. To refuse to guide me around the place of the college is also saying something important about a lack of engagement with that space. It refuses the logic that being a student in a space means occupying it or knowing it. And it introduces the possibility that the space is unusable, or at least unused. Not to describe a place is, in some ways, to provide a very different kind of narrative about it. To say that your relationship to it has never been articulated and perhaps doesn't need to be articulated. What these moments highlight for me is how difficult it is as a researcher to respond to moments that are non-narrative. As you can see from my responses, I'm very quick to turn these moments back into narratives. I can do so from the perspectives of narrative capability and epistemic justice. I can say, for example, that without a narrative of place and of oneself in place, a person cannot participate in the discourses about distribution and place-specific inequality through which further inequalities are reinforced, and through which these inequalities might also be challenged. I can say that the difficulty of engaging with questions about place shows just how a lack of narrative capability robs someone of the possibility of participating in what's known about a place, the ways in which a place is known, and by whom. In this way, I can see that the research contexts which demand that participants conform to narrative form are also opportunities for them to participate. in the way that Butler sees discourse, narrative and subjectivity, conformity is the cost of recognition, and it is one we consistently pay because the alternative is to be unrecognizable. I'm returning to the principles with which I started this presentation, that narrative offers the possibility that the unheard and unseen are included and can speak and are recognized. But I am also aware that research itself has a narrative form. It requires conformity, coherence, a sequential and linear narrative, and in particular, it requires conclusion. The narrative conclusion and the forms by which we judge it demand that this conclusion is comprehensible as it follows on from the previous event, and that it justifies the entire sequence of the narrative if it's read from end to beginning. The conclusions I drew from moments that seemed to be non-narrative performed exactly this kind of maneuver. They established causality. This student participated in this way because of their relationship to space, to the future, or to place, and therefore we can conclude something from their participation about a larger phenomenon. I've not yet found another way of responding to non-narrative moments, if that is indeed what those moments were, and if there is such a thing. But I have two thoughts with regard to these moments, which I'm going to finish with today. The first is that for me, the moments are reminders about the power that the researcher has. I have control over how these moments are re-narrated, how responses to them are shaped, and what conclusions are drawn from them. The research narrative, the story of the research, in contrast to the narratives that form the substance of the research itself, is often the most powerful and is at least the most widely distributed story. The second is a reminder of how quickly a challenge to narrative becomes resubsumed in narrative, and sometimes even bolsters the conclusions of that narrative. Is it possible to slow this process, to find time or space around the non-narrative? And is this the closest we come to the kind of impossibility that is just beyond articulation? Is there room in narrative for that?
Thank you, Holly. Are you happy to take questions?
I am, yes.
Three at a time or one at a time?
Probably one at a time will help me keep it in